of countries and regions to meet these threats using a positive peace framework. Now, in terms of housekeeping, I've noticed everybody has got their microphone on mute now, so if we could just remain like that until the Q&A session at the end, that would be great, thank you. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the event, please write them in the chat and we will do our best to respond to them at the end. And also, just to make everybody aware, I will now be recording the session tonight, and this will also be made available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Okay, so I would like to start by showing a short video by the United Nations, which is called Urgent Solutions for Urgent Times, and it approximately goes for 6 minutes. And I would like to encourage you each to write one thing in the chat, one word in the chat that explains maybe the emotions that this video evokes for you. And then after the video, we'll just sort of have a look at them and a brief discussion. So enjoy the video, and we'll see you very soon.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
September 2020. The world is still in the grip of a global pandemic. There have been more than 27 million confirmed cases, and more than 900,000 people have died. Billions of people have been in lockdown for months. Lives and livelihoods have been threatened and lost. But as some lockdowns are easing, people are emerging into a different, uncertain world with a new appetite for change.
Today, we feel the weight of history on our shoulders. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how fragile the world is. A microscopic virus has put us on our knees. And that fragility should make us humble.
COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray, exposing fractures in the skeleton of the societies we have built. A world with great inequality, which must be righted. And a world which must win the battle against climate catastrophe.
The whole planet is at stake. So this is a moment to recognize that the way we have been moving leads nowhere, and that we need to change course.
The lockdowns also showed that our environment itself can change. In the Punjab, for the first time in generations, the Himalayas are visible once again. Lions have reclaimed the roads in Kruger National Park. In Venice, the canals run clear once more. And across Italy, dolphins have returned.
If you look at the response of people to COVID-19, people dramatically change their lives. But people have shown an enormous capacity to adapt to new circumstances, an enormous capacity to change the way they live, the way they work, the way they organize themselves. So, change is possible. The problem is political will. It is so decided.
On the 25th of September 2015, all United Nations member states signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, a set of solutions for the biggest problems the world faces. We're going to look at the 4 key must take urgent action, starting with climate and our planet.
Next door's on fire. Oh my god. Okay. I'm scared.
You're at risk. Leaving now is the safest option, so leave now towards the beach and shelter in place.
We're going. Just getting in his car. Wait, I need you guys because the whole place is on fire. Oh my god, my neighbor's house. Okay. Come on, Clay, we need to go. This is a real nightmare. I can't believe this is real. I can't see anything. This is literally not real. This is not real. Oh my freaking god. All I want is my family.
Pictures and stories continue to file out from Australia about the devastating fires. This one, a satellite image from NASA.
Naciones que alcanzaron hasta 2,5 metros en la capital are essential and massive evacuation in Indonesia, as was a storm wave to Jakarta, following the heaviest downfall in more than 2 decades. Worst plague of locusts to affect the region.
The damage to pastures and crops could create severe consequences for the region, where nearly 12 million people are moving in. It could be the worst the area has seen in 20 years.
This is a double whammy. We're dealing with the cyclone and with exposure to COVID.
Well, the fires raging in Northern California have now become some of the largest in state history. More than 12,000 firefighters are currently battling the places that have
San Francisco Bay Area smothered by some of the worst air quality on the planet.
Valley reaches an all-time high of 100.
Diddy on Tuesday recorded the temperature
Liking about 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, so I think that video, is quite powerful and demonstrates the ecological threats we are currently facing in Australia and across the globe. And I didn't see any words go into the chat, but if anyone wants to write one word, would love to see that. Yep, agree, powerful. Changing systems, absolutely sad. Yep. I think I agree. And for me, that video gives that sense of urgency around climate action, a strong feeling towards the people and the communities who are affected, and I guess a concern for the future. Yep, really confronting, yep. Okay, so I think that's a good segue into our discussion this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our impressive panel speakers this evening. So we have Charles Allen from the Institute of Economics and Peace, Glenn Klotowski from the Climate Action Network Australia, Anna Pal, Director of Countering Violent Extremism Unit at the Department of Justice and Community Safety, and Deborah Hart, co-founder of Climate. So I'll now hand it over to our speakers to introduce themselves and the organisations that they're representing. Thank you. We might start with yourself, Glenn, if that's okay.
Hi, sorry about that. Long day of Zooming, too many times trying to demute. My name's Glenn Klotowski. I am a strategist at the Climate Action Network Australia. Climate Action Network is a global set of nodes, some regional, some national, that represent networks in politically useful regions. There's a European node, there's a US node, there's a Southeast Asian node, and in Australia we've been running, next year will be our 20th anniversary. We have around 120 members at the moment, who range from big multinational NGOs like WWF and Greenpeace, and then all the way through to suburban or regional local action groups. And our role is to try and bring all of those entities together to a common set of understanding of the issues, to be able to have conversations about how to have the most impact as organisations, to learn off each other, be inspired by each other, also to connect regionally and internationally at particular moments, such as big global conferences, or where there's, for example, a visit by the Prime Minister to a nation like Japan, who've just committed to substantial climate goals under the Paris Agreement. My goal in particular, and my role, is to help support strategic thinking and then combined work and implementation across that range of organisations. We don't just represent climate advocacy groups. We have some union representation, some social service groups and others, and that is growing. But more than that, also a big task of ours is to ensure that we are connecting to other coordinated movements, social movements and other movements around Australia. Final thing is we also work with other key stakeholders across climate advocacy issues, the business community, farming, agriculture, Indigenous community, and a range of other key communities where we can work together collaboratively and effectively and add value to each other's work and increase our potency where decisions are being made. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Glenn. Now, Charles, would you like to go next?
Thank you. My name's Charles Allen. I'm the Director of Partnerships with the Institute for Economics and Peace. And the Institute for Economics and Peace is an independent, not-for-profit think tank. We're headquartered here in Sydney, in Australia, but we're a small organisation, but a global organisation with offices in New York, Mexico, The Hague, Brussels, and Harare. We're basically in the business of measuring peace. Not only measuring peace, but also putting a cost on the economic benefit of peace, and also a cost on the economic impact of violence. So we have a team of researchers, and really their role is to be quantitative researchers. What they're good at is bringing together a range of data sets, build an understanding of complex problems, and telling the stories that data has to tell. That's not my role. I'm a practitioner. My role is about taking that research and operationalising it. And we do that through a range of different modalities. And thank you for the invite to participate tonight.
Thank you, Charles. Okay, the next on my screen is Anna.
Thanks, Fran. As Fran mentioned, my name is Anna Parr. I'm the Director of the Countering Violent Extremism Unit at the Department of Justice and Community Safety in Victoria. So I am probably a bureaucrat of this crew, and my unit focuses on the prevention of violent extremism and stopping people from radicalising to violent extremism. And I guess the best way of describing it is when you have a spectrum and you have terrorism at one end of the spectrum, which requires a law enforcement response. We work before that, so we're looking at stopping individuals or communities radicalising to violence and committing acts of terror. And I've worked with Charles too in a previous life, and one of the things I guess my role looks at is aligning efforts across government, also with our law enforcement agencies, not-for-profit, and the community, about how do we stop people radicalising to violence because of the negative effects and the impact that it has on the entire community. And look, it's a really timely. Victoria is one of the first state governments to actually set up a unit like this and to look at CVE, which is countering violent extremism, in a really, really targeted way. Most states and territories now do that, but in Australia raised its national threat or national terror level to probable in September 2014. So since that time, there's been a lot of work moving into prevention and early intervention space. And there is actually a link with violent extremism and some of the effects of what's happening with climate change, which we'll talk about a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and we do look forward to delving a little bit deeper into that later. Okay, Deborah?
Hi, I'm Deborah Hart, and I'm representing Climart this evening. So Climart is a climate and arts advocacy group. We started a decade ago now, just a few weeks ago. It was a decade, but we started with the express purpose of creating a voice for the arts, for a voice around ecological issues, particularly around climate, but the way that they all converge with social justice issues. And we really thought that what was kind of missing from the conversation, whilst we need all of the best available science, the data, the evidence, we also really need to connect with it, and that stories do that best, particularly in situations where we have a lot of information disorder out there. So we've worked with hundreds of artists and with, probably about 60 different gallerists now. We work locally in Victoria as well as across Australia, and we've worked internationally. But our main goal with Climart is really to connect people to the narratives around this, and your video, I think, did that extremely well. Because without culture, without really understanding what all of these threats mean to us, mean to our families, our communities, they can seem, one, overwhelming because they are, but also it can be very difficult for people to truly connect with how they can really make a difference and how they can actually become more informed and more effective, because when people are, then they tend to take action. So thank you very much for including me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Deborah. Beautiful. Okay. So in September this year, the inaugural edition of the Ecological Threat Register was launched by the Institute of Economics and Peace. So I will hand it over to Charles Allen to give us an overview of the report and its findings, and then we will then progress into our panel discussion. And so, as I mentioned before, we welcome you to ask any questions or make comments in the chat, and we'll look at responding to them later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. I've shared my screen with you. So I've mentioned the Institute for Economics and Peace, and as I said, we're in the business of measuring peace, and certainly the research we're going to talk to tonight is really that intersection of climate and peace. You can see in this slide some of the research products that the Institute produces. We're most known for the Global Peace Index, which is in its the 2020 edition is its 14th year. Global Terrorism Index is another well-known piece of research by the Institute of Economics and Peace. The Positive Peace Report, which I'll refer to a little bit tonight. And you can see some other examples of the type of work that we do. Our SDG 16 Plus Progress Report, Sustainable Development Goals Progress Report, and some subnational research there. An example that is on display there is the Mexico Peace Index. So why do we do this research? Well, I guess we position our research as practitioner-focused research. The reason we do it is prior to the Institute doing this work wasn't being done. So the question was asked, how is it that peace builders, people working in social change, people working in policy, decision makers, CSOs, communities, how can you make decisions without the data? So the Institute, nearly 15 years ago, set about filling that gap. And the other thing is that we want research to be readable, to be accessible, to be understandable, and to be practical. So that certainly comes out when you have a look at our research products. The research picked up very widely. You can see some of the numbers here with the reach that we get from our research, phenomenal media reach, particularly around the launch time of Global Peace Index, Ecological Threats Register and other products. Our social media reach is extensive. It's picked up across 150 different countries. And you can see there some of the organisations it talks. This slide's talking to some of the multilaterals that pick up our research, but it's picked up from a really wide range of users, from down to grassroots community people. The Global Peace Index, I mentioned, we're in our 20th edition of the Global Peace Index. I'm not going to talk to this tonight, but I encourage you to go to our website, Vision of Humanity. All of our research is freely available. If there's something that piques your interest from our discussion tonight, I encourage you to visit the research and delve deeper into the methodology and get a deeper understanding. Also this year we produced some research looking at the impact of COVID-19 and peace. Obviously that's going to be a progressive piece of research over the coming years, but this research was tough to get a sense of what is the impact and what are the trends of COVID-19 on peace. So if you're going to measure peace, you really need to start with, measure anything I guess, you need to start with a definition. We work with two definitions. First of all, a negative definition being the absence of violence and the absence of fear of violence. And that definition is the definition that we use to build our global peace index, our most known research piece. So really that is, I mentioned at the start that we're in the business of aggregating data sets. We don't physically collect data ourselves, but aggregate data sets to make sense of it. So really this report is counting the broken bits, if you like. Whereas we also use a positive definition, being attitudes, institutions and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. This is really far more powerful research because it's counting the good bits, if you like. It's counting a country, a community, a society's capacity to be peaceful. So just how do we derive that positive definition? It builds, with that we build the Positive Peace Report, which is currently in its 2019 edition. The 2020 edition will be launched later this year. But we did this by looking at the least peaceful countries, by looking at the most peaceful countries. Because we had the Global Peace Index, we were able to identify the most peaceful countries. We looked at thousands of data sets to identify, well, what's happening? What's happening in those social systems that makes them the most peaceful countries? So the thinking is, if you want to understand peace, why would you be studying violence, which is effectively the Global Peace Index, looking at those broken bits, is studying violence. So we turned our focus to studying what is occurring, what we can see that's statistically relevant in the most peaceful countries, and that led to the Positive Peace Index. So there are a number of indicators that we use to build the Positive Peace Report, and we're able to build those into this taxonomy, this framework called the Positive Peace Framework. You can see the 8 pillars there. I won't read them all out in the interest of time, but when you look across those pillars, you go, oh well, there's no real surprises here. That makes sense. Of course, if you're going to have a peaceful society, you need good relations with neighbours. Of course, you need a well-functioning government. Of course, you need acceptance of the rights of the others. So you know that this stuff intuitively. But what the Positive Peace Report does, and what our research does, is demonstrates that empirically. But what it also does is demonstrates how the pillars are linked, how they operate together as a system. So this is systems thinking. What we know about the Positive Peace Report and why it's been really helpful in building the ecological threat register, we know that countries, communities, societies with high levels of positive peace have a range of other positive indicators across economic, social and environmental indicators. So we know that high positive peace countries have high per capita income. Their higher positive peace countries are more resilient. A lot of the work we do around resilience building is because of that relationship we can demonstrate between resilience and high levels of positive peace. High positive peace countries have better environmental outcomes, have better measures of well-being across a range of indicators. High positive peace countries perform better against the Millennial Development Goals. And from our tracking of the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that high positive peace countries are performing better in achievements against the SDGs. So, we're here tonight to give you a brief glimpse at the Ecological Threat Register. Once again, this research is available online tonight, which is just about raising the interest, encouraging you to go to the report and delve into the report, have a deeper look at the findings and the methodology. So, and Fran, in the introduction, thank you. It is our inaugural edition of the Ecological Threat Register. Once again, it's about us drawing together relevant data sets. I should say that IEP, Institute for Economics and Peace, does the work in drawing together the data sets, but decisions around the pieces of data used are decided by an international panel of experts. This report, it covers off on 157 countries, and that covers off on 97% of the world's population. Clearly, 157 countries, it's not all the countries. It's pretty simple. The data sets have got to exist for us to be able to compare country to country. Or if there's some gaps in the data sets, we need to be able to source proxy indicators to be able to build meaningful data around a particular country. It covers off on 8 ecological threats, being food security, water scarcity, population growth, droughts, floods, sea level rises, cyclones, rising temperatures. So the range of threats is drawn together in the Ecological Threat Register. As I said, it's developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace. But what's important is that it also brings in a country's resilience, so a country's ability to deal with threats as they arise. The Ecological Threat Register also extrapolates the threats that we identify out to 2050. So it is a snapshot in time now of current threats, but also projects out to 2050 for the threats we can expect in the coming decades. So I'm not going to delve too deep into the methodology or the data, but just give you a taste of some of the data sets that are drawn together. Natural disasters, the introductory video, which Fran was very powerful at, is really supportive, this data set is really supportive of that visual. You can see that natural disasters have quadrupled over the last 4 decades, and with the real large rises being hydrological events and meteorological events. One that really interests us in Australia is fires, which fall into this category. There has been some climbers in those events, but you can see that it's those hydrological and meteorological events that have been the real rises. Another data set that's drawn in and then extrapolated out to 2050 is the rising concern about water-related risk. I won't dive into talking deep onto this data set, but you can see the more red, the more danger for particular regions. Looking at water-related risk by region. see the concerns for the MENA region as well as South Africa, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, let's just touch on some high-level highlights out of the highlights. I'm not sure they're quite highlights, but probably more lowlights out of the ecological threat register. But what we identified, remember we looked at 157 countries in this report. 141 of those 157 countries are exposed to at least one ecological threat between now and 2050. 19 of the countries with the most threats are home to 2.1 billion people currently. 10 of these threats, or 10 of these 19 countries are also amongst the 40 least peaceful countries on the globe as rated by our Global Peace Index. 6.4 billion people live in the countries that live in countries which are exposed to medium or high ecological threats. And we've clustered these ecological hotspots into 3 zones, and I'll demonstrate this on a map for you very shortly. Those 3 zones at greatest risk being the Sahel Horn Belt of Africa, Mauritania through to Somalia, the Southern African Belt from Angola to Madagascar, the Middle East and Central Asia Belt from Syria to Pakistan. So interesting that of only 2 of the countries that are most threat are amongst the 10 largest recipients of climate-related aid. I think this is significant because what it's suggesting is that our ODA for climate-related aid probably isn't going to the areas of most need. We can identify as a result of population shifts that 3 major migration routes being Latin America through to the US and Canada, Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa through to Europe, and also South Asia and Middle East to Europe. We can see that 1.2 billion people on the globe in high risk, low resilience countries are at risk of displacement between now and 2050. That's 1.2 billion people. Just thinking back to probably the last decade and the impact of the movement of a few million people, probably 5 to 7 million people, the impact that that's had on the globe, the impact that it's had on peacefulness, the impact that it's had on attitudes, and this number is significant. So we know if nothing happens from this point on, from a climate change perspective, there was no change from this point on, we could still see that ecological threats will lead to failed states. So that's a fairly gloomy picture that I've painted, but it's the reality of what the data is talking. So here it is mapped out on a map. So the darker the red, if you like, the deeper the colour, the greater the ecological threat and the lower the resilience of the country. Remember, it's not just looking at the aggregated ecological threats, it's also looking at the resilience of a country. And Australia is a really good example of this. Australia, I think, aggregates 3 ecological threats. It's not too hard to guess what they are. Concerns, the fire concerns that we've experienced, water concerns that we have experienced as well. But having said that, Australia is a highly resilient country. And I think we've demonstrated that during what's been the largest global shock in recent times in our response to COVID-19, and also demonstrated that in our response to last season's fires. But anyway, coming back to the countries at threat, you can see those 3 belts that I mentioned, the Sahel, Sub-Saharan belt, the Southern African belt, and that Central Asia to belt as well, and the predicted migration routes as a result of ecological change in the coming decades. Okay. Right. Just some really quick calls to action. You know, what are some things that we can do? Certainly, deepening our research is a really good start. You know, if we want to have a deeper understanding of what can be done at a community level, you know, we can bring the same macro level thinking down to the community level, and certainly we've done that across a number of countries. There's some examples there. The most recent being the German Peace Index, which we produced this year. Mexico have been a big adopter of the work of IEP, and we've produced subnational indices for Mexico for the last 7 years. And we can bring that same thinking down to local government area. So it really is bringing that thinking, that approach down to local government area, certainly as policymakers, people thinking about resourcing decisions and the like. Other calls to action, you know, we certainly encourage people to deepen their understanding of positive peace and resilience. There's a number of ways that we can assist that through our online Positive Peace Academy and our ambassadors program. It gives people the opportunity to get a deeper understanding of our research, not only our research, but how to activate around our research. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so everyone else can have a chance and we can open for some discussion. Thank you for the opportunity to give you a brief look at the Ecological Threat Register and look forward to the discussion from this point on.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for the overview. I think the ETR is innovative and unique in that it does not look at climate and peace as isolated issues, but rather gives us the data and the evidence to understand much better the interconnections between the two. So in saying that, I would like to move into the panel discussion and just start with my first question, which will be to all the panellists. How may each of you utilise data such as the Ecological Threat Register as a tool to enhance the work you do in your respective areas? So I might start with you, Deborah, if you're happy to respond. Sorry, you're just on mute.
Is that not the term for 2020? Let me repeat, it deserves repeating. Brilliant, it's absolutely brilliant and incredibly valuable. Groups like ours really do rely so much on the reports of organisations like yours. They underpin all of the more emotional work that we do. So I think it's fantastic and I'm really grateful, really appreciative for it. It's harrowing, but as long as we can curate some of these narratives so that people can feel a greater agency in working with them and how they can work within their own local communities, I think it's really, it provides opportunities for solutions, to bring in the solutions we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And Anna?
Yeah, look, I find this, and I was saying to Charles earlier before, this data for us is really fascinating. So when you are advising government, and I think when we're looking at government and policy, nothing is in isolation. So it's not like we create or develop policy here for Victoria or federally for the Australian government that doesn't have far-reaching implications. One of the things I think that's come out of this report that really helps me in my work is looking at, and I think that figure was just mind-boggling, the 1.2 billion of possible displacement. And we've seen already across Europe back in 2015 with the refugee crisis what happens when you have displaced populations on a number, not just in my area of terrorism and violent extremism, but it's forced migration, and fleeing conflict is one of the worst things that can happen to any society. And we've even seen it recently with Syria and the return of foreign fighters and families coming back. And we need to plan for it, and we need to have policies in place that deal with it. and that deal with it in a really humane way and a way that strengthens social cohesion and really increases community resilience and doesn't result in terrorism and violent extremism and chaos and instability and all of those other things. So I guess and I worked with Charles too on the terrorism index, but also the peace index, and it definitely helps, I think, government and policymakers really understand what the impacts are going to be, and it's we need evidence-based policy, and we need good research behind the decisions that we're making.
Thank you, Anna. And Glenn, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the work, first of all. I think it's an exceptional document and some great thinking. Over the last few years, I've worked firstly now with Climate Action Network, and before that with 350.org, which is a global activist organisation on climate change issues. And it really reminded me of a forum we had of our global team early in 2019 for 350, where halfway through the week-long get-together, a photo was taken of all of the participants and a clear statement that photo was not to be shared anywhere. The reason being that people in 350 who work in the Middle East, who work in many African nations, who work in many South American nations, who work in the Philippines, who work in Indonesia, their life is threatened if they're identified as being active on climate issues. And to me, that word resilience, and the other key word out of this document is institutions, is that there are a whole heap of indicators of those nations which are least capable of dealing with what climate change and ecological threat is doing to those nations. And the human cost, right down to that scenario of here's a photo of 150 odd people from around the world, which unfortunately got shared by 2 people, and our organisation had to put in strategies to try and make sure that our own people did not disappear off the face of the planet. And that statement was done on the day when one of our Brazilian team found out that one of the indigenous groups they worked with closely, one of their leaders had been murdered that day. And to me, the resilience and institutional stuff is all about the big picture, but also about those personal stories and what it means for each individual. The other thing that comes to mind are the now well-told stories about the rise of conflict in Sudan and the Darfur, and also the rise of conflict in Syria and the link to ecological and climate disasters as 2 really exceptional outcomes. The final thing for me is, Australia is a good example, but the richest place on earth is California. 38 million people, 5th biggest economy on earth on its own, and literally large parts of California are becoming uninhabitable because of climate threats. These last fires are the worst, but the ones before it, just 2 years ago, wiped a city of 30,000 human beings off the face of the planet. A city called Paradise disappeared. California can cope with that because it's the richest place on earth and it has strong institutions and resilience. But if it's happening in California, imagine the stories we're not seeing in so many other places like Pakistan and many of these nations that you've identified. And thank you very much. And one really important thing is to remind us who live in these safe countries where you can advocate for change and come home at night and feel totally safe that you are not going to be disappeared or picked up by a car in the middle of the night and dragged away. So I really appreciate the work.
Thank you, Glenn. And I think my next question is for you again, Glenn. So in the short video that was played earlier in the session, so Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, refers to there being a lack of political will to act on climate change. Now, in your experience, how are you working with governments to reimagine national environment laws? Have you had some wins? And what work do you believe needs to still be done?
A really great question, and I could go on for a very long time. It's a really interesting situation. Of course, Australia is wealthy and safe, strong institutions, and resilient. It is definitely facing the impacts of climate change and facing ecological disasters. There's no doubt about it. We have been victim, I think, over the last 2 or 3 decades, as have a couple of other sort of Anglosphere nations, particularly the US and Canada, to the culture war of action on climate and environment. And we have gone from when I first started as an activist nearly 30 years ago, where John Hewson was the leader of the Liberal Party in Australia, and he had a carbon price in his 1992 political position for the nation, to a point where we had a Prime Minister of the same party in 2013 voted in saying that climate change was rubbish. This incredible funding by particularly fossil fuel companies and extreme political elements of campaigns to make the issue of environmental protection and climate change into cultural and social issues has had a devastating impact on the ability to get rational, sensible policy passed in nations like Australia, the US and Canada. It's been extraordinary to watch the difference between a nation like the UK, headed by a Conservative government. That Conservative government is largely advised by an Australian PR company that used to run the Liberal Party in Australia, in fact still probably does, and in Britain, they are extraordinarily far ahead on climate policy in particular. Yesterday they announced that there will be no internal combustion engine cars sold, new cars sold, from 2030 onwards. That is a nation with a Conservative government advised by the same PR leaders as our nation, and yet we have gone down the path of the Republican Party and made this into an impenetrable mess. I worked really effectively with the Howard government when I was working for WWF in the early 2000s on water reform, on environmental reform, and on some climate movement. And I was able to have a conversation with what was at that time an incredibly conservative government. This current government in the federal sphere is impenetrable. There is no access whatsoever for anyone who wants to advocate for better policy on climate and environment. Having said that, we are seeing change quite rapidly right now, and in particular, one of the most exciting places is a Liberal government in New South Wales, who have just announced one of the most extraordinary renewable energy policy statements, not just in Australian history, but globally, which will fast track beyond even the most ambitious renewable energy expectations, 200% faster than anything put on the table by any government in Australia, and is being passed right now in New South Wales Parliament by a Liberal government. And the minister who put it together stood next to the leader of the National Party announcing this. So things are shifting. The economics of action on climate have shifted. The business community has shifted, and things like the election of a Biden government in the US will continue that process. But I'll be completely honest, the last 7 or 8 years in Australia has been catastrophic at a federal level on environment or climate policy. It has been a disaster. And in fact, going back even to sort of 2008, 2009, where we had a Rudd government working with the Turnbull opposition to try and bring forward a carbon price. That was derailed, and that was the start not just of a disastrous period for environmental and climate policy, but a disastrous period for the quality of our governance. And in fact, going back to that earlier discussion about resilience and institutions, here in one of the wealthiest nations on earth with incredible natural heritage and every reason to shift and become positive on climate change advocacy around the world, because we are getting badly affected by climate change, even in a nation like ours, the pushback by institutional powers against any change towards better environmental climate advocacy can rapidly shift the resilience of your governance model. And it has been a very sad thing to watch. And just I have conversations with, colleagues of mine who I've worked with for decades here in Australia and around the world. And, we are an example of how bad it can get in a rich nation, which should be doing a good job, when ideology comes in, funded by the vested interests, and attacks directly the core institutions of our democracy. And look, we are seeing the Trumpism stuff, we're seeing all this stuff around the world. Hopefully things are turning, but 20 years ago, I could not have imagined how bad things are right now in Australia. It is just unreal. So I wish I had a better story to tell. I really do. My life would have been a lot easier than it has been. But at a federal level, it's been a catastrophic failure.
Thank you, Glenn. And I'm just wondering whether, Deborah, you would like to add to that question, and particularly respond drawing from your stories, the stories that you feature in your book of climate change activists.
Okay, Glenn, thank you. That was pretty much summed it up. One thing I would like to kind of pick apart too, though, is that I believe that it's as a result of so much great work that was done with climate advocacy that we have ended up in such a radically reactionary place now. So Australia, we're a giant quarry. We have been for a very long time. And so if we go back to what Rudd, the Ken Henry package that was proposed at the time for a super profits tax, do you remember that? It was basically based on what Norway had done in 1990. It would benefit everybody. So it was basically a royalty paid directly into what would be like a sovereign wealth fund for Australia. And to put this in perspective, Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It has recently divested from all fossil fuels, even though that's the source of its enormous wealth. So when a simple policy, proven, nothing radical whatsoever was presented, there was $22 million spent on a campaign. Within weeks, the Prime Minister was dumped. So then in comes Gillard. Then, because the Greens' condition of helping her form government was to form the multi-party climate change committee. So, and the Abbott government basically refused to join and, threw flames at it the entire time, but it was phenomenally effective. So they went through this process of listening to experts, and experts in, science and health and economics and engineering right across the spectrum. So it really converged a whole lot of really vital information. And then they created this suite of, I think it was 18 bills that were collaborative. They crossed through to, regenerative agriculture. They, transport, really sophisticated suite of ecological and climate protection bills. And they basically were phenomenally successful. So for this brief period of time that they ran, which was, roughly July 2012 to 2014, before the Abbott government killed it, and didn't entirely kill all of the features of it, but handicapped, we've seen what's happened with ARENA and the, the CFC. We've seen how the the soil carbon programs that were attached to it. So they really had to do a lot of work to dismantle what were arguably the world's most effective climate and ecological bills in the world. So not only did these measures create hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the rural economies that needed them most, emissions were coming down, and energy security was really kind of on the horizon. So you've just got to again ask, why would a government kill such a positive, in all ways, suite of bills? And I think now we can really see that we have been occupied by the fossil fuel industry, and not just the fossil fuel industry, the economy that supports it. So the banks, the accountants, the law firms. So I feel, Glenn, a little bit, whilst I absolutely share the utter frustration and just, sense of doom, I also kind of think, okay, for a country like ours, this is a moment. We've seen how the Murdoch press has, with the arson emergency over summer, James Murdoch, he even actually resigned from the board of his own family company. That was kind of seismic. So we're seeing now with a bipartisan approach. So we've had Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull join together. So members from completely the opposite side of the team join together and work on this Murdoch Royal Commission. Sarah Hanson-Young put up a move to hold a Senate inquiry into media diversity, which that's what it's called, but everybody knows it's about exploring the role of Murdoch. One of the groups I work with, Climact, we've actually just put it in the day that Kevin Rudd announced his petition, his national petition. It was delayed by one day, which was a fabulous kind of twist of fate because it enabled us to learn about it and include it in our own submission to the ACCC. So we've worked with lawyers to basically craft a complaint around the rights of consumers of news and information services to be protected against false and misleading claims. So it's another angle. But, we're seeing pushback to this. And as Glenn's pointed out, in all the states and spectacularly, both in South Australia and New South Wales, but since this week, New South Wales, a race to transition and to transition fairly and to reach across the aisles and work with different partners. So, there has been a phenomenal disservice to Australians, to our country. And where would we be? We should be asking ourselves now, where would we be? This is 10 years on from when that really phenomenal suite of bills was brought in. Our emissions would have been significantly lower. We would have been well and truly on the track to be decarbonised. Our soils would have been healthier, more resilient, more water stored. So, what do we start looking at class action lawsuits? What do we really do now? But one of the things that I really was thinking of when I was listening to Charles's presentation was around what Australian companies are doing overseas. So in Africa, for example, I believe that the most number of mining companies operating in Africa are actually Australian owned. The opaque supply chains that exist around the world. What is our responsibility? What is our investment in that? And shouldn't we have a right to know? What is our money doing in terms of our super funds and our banks? What is our money doing behind our back? So, these are questions to tease out. The information shouldn't be as difficult as it is to find. And of course, the information disorder campaigns are exactly designed to make it overwhelming and difficult for ordinary people to just get answers so that they can take some responsibility in their own lives and do the right thing. Was that a rant?
It's fantastic. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so my next question will be for Anna, and it is around how the impact of climate change can aggravate the root causes of violent extremism. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain some of those root causes to us, and then tell us how that can impact us here in Australia.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important when we're talking, or when I'm talking about violent extremism, to be really clear in what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about violence that is religiously, politically, or ideologically motivated. And there's no one size fits all looking at individuals that are going to radicalise to violent extremism. So it's the process itself, like the process of radicalisation to violence, is highly idiosyncratic. So it really depends on a person's personal history, their motivations, their networks, their experiences, their grievances, whether they're perceived or real. And that's actually what makes working in the area of violent extremism, terrorism, so hard. It's not linear. You can't say, okay, A plus B plus C, that's going to happen. So the drivers of violent extremism are very varied. However, there is sort of circumstances that are common to allow violent extremism to flourish. So that is basically if you have instability, if you have inequality, vulnerability and chaos and scarcity of resources, you will have violent extremism, and you probably most likely have acts of terror as well. So that sort of, I guess, sets the scene about what we're, the context in which it's operating. In terms of some of the root causes, well, they can be varied, but everything such as anxiety around globalisation, loss of faith in democracy, which Glenn touched on before, and I think that's a really, really big one, and loss of faith in the democratic process, and we're seeing that in the States at the moment. It depends on where in the world you're looking, but you have political oppression that can lead to violent extremism, foreign occupation, religious superiority or extremism. That's where we find a lot about Islamist extremism, that they're taking a very, very singular religious focus. The dilution of national identity is a big one, the rise of nationalism, and mass migration. So there's quite a few drivers. Now, climate change is going to exacerbate and aggravate probably all of them. But what I am particularly concerned about, and sort of, I guess, touching on a bit of Charles's presentation before, is this role of mass migration. And we're already seeing around the world that forced and mass migration has led to a rise in nationalism and far right-wing extremism. Now, I could talk all day and all night about far-right extremism and some of the vulnerability factors around that. But I actually think that's what's going to be exacerbated first and foremost. And I also think the loss of faith in democracy is of real concern, because it's twofold. Not only will a loss of faith in democracy give rise to greater instability and inequality, which is our perfect environment for violent extremism and terrorism to flourish, but it's also going to thwart global efforts on climate change. So where we're needing global cooperation, global strategies, and agreed definitions. It's that, if we don't have working, fully functional democracies, then that process is going to be thwarted. So in terms of what that means for us in Australia, or what I would be advising governments or community organisations on, is I think we really need to be aware of the growing rise in right-wing extremism and also nationalism. Now, this thing called reciprocal radicalisation, where the far right and the far left become so polarised that they radicalise each other, and they both have equal capacity to be violent. So even in the US, we're seeing that with Trump and the election outcome, is they're all, we literally have a row of police separating Trump supporters and pro-Biden supporters, and they're equally getting this as violence. So there is that reciprocal radicalisation, and I think the fake news, and I think some of the panellists have touched on it before, it's this age of disinformation, and where we have social media, and even I've seen Twitter have put out hundreds of, every time Donald Trump tweets, they will sort of put out a disclaimer to it. So that's that the misinformation around climate change, around solutions to climate change, that really needs to be a focus for any government, not just the Australian government, not even just state governments, because you're always balancing up freedom of speech with whether or not it's the right information I'm getting out there. So I think that's probably a bit of a roundabout, but I will make one comment. There's a really interesting piece of work being done by Victoria University at the moment, which is looking at the interconnectedness, and I'm just going to look at my notes here because I didn't do this research, between traditional security objectives and planetary health. So basically what they're saying is what is the relationship between countries and their national security and their measures and their threats, and how is that affecting the health of the planet? And is it harming or is it hindering? Which is, I think, is a really different paradigm that we've looked through national security and terrorism for. We've always been, these are things that we have to do for terrorism protection and national security protection, and we're not really going to worry about what effect that has elsewhere. So some of the interesting things that they identified as part of their literature review is that armed conflict currently affects countries covering around 11% of the Earth's surface. So if you think around the world, 11% is in armed conflict at this point in time. Now, nearly half of the 850 million people living in extreme poverty are fleeing from or currently in armed conflict areas. So that point in itself is what we all have to be, governments should be dealing with around the world, because we are going to see that mass and forced migration. And terrorist and insurgency conflict in the last 10 years has gone up about 125%. Now, obviously that results in significant civilian fatalities, but it also has devastating effects on the environment and devastating environmental impacts. Like if we think of the Middle East, if we think of Africa, where we're having an incredible, the whole history has been armed conflict, that the natural degradation of the natural heritage there has been nothing short of catastrophic. Actually, war is the worst thing that can happen to any civilization. And then I found this part really interesting, is that the study this year found that a 1% rise in terrorism gives rise to at least a 0.3% increase in CO2 emissions. So we're not going to we have to get on top of this problem. So, yeah, that's the relationship at the moment.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, I was on mute, yes.
That's all right.
Yeah, it's just outstanding. Okay, so I want to move over to Glenn. So I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of partnerships in achieving the SDGs? And can you share some examples of how member organisations of Climate Action Network Australia have collaborated to progress the SDGs, particularly in climate action, but also peace, their agenda? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ren. I'm going to do a couple. I'll give Australian example first. In my personal experience, I find that the SDGs are much lower status in Australia than in some other places around the world, particularly in Europe. But that many of the people I work with in Australia know the SDGs, understand them, and certainly in my mind, in my work on the SDGs, like I think 13 and 16 are sensible putting together in today's discussion. But I look at zero hunger, I look at good health, I look at the role of women in society, and a whole heap of the goals are very closely connected to environmental and climate impacts. And it's really well encapsulated in the document for this meeting, but in many other places as well, there is a direct correlation between the goals from the UN and environmental and climate outcomes. In Australia, we've
My
worked
gift.
hard over
My
many
Diwali
years to
gift.
bring as many coalitions together as possible.
Some you got it.
I'll give you an example of an atrocious
I invested
situation which led to
I
very
bought
bad
this stock,
political outcomes just last
I
year.
finally bought this stock
And that
today.
was
It was a real
when,
estate stock,
and
and
I
it's
hope
doing
I
really
don't
well.
insult too many
I'm
people
just
on
really
this call,
stressed
but
about
when a
buying
bunch
stock
of
for you
wealthy
because I feel
Tesla
like if I
drivers
lose it, I'm not too
from the
fast,
south
but no,
drove up
I'm
into
so
poor
stressed.
central
No, but then I
Queensland
bought it yesterday, and then the US
and
market
came
crashed
across
last night,
as
so
though they were
Australia's
telling
crashing
those
too.
people
I was like, oh, thank
that
God, I
they
didn't
should
so
not
bad.
have the
I mean,
economic
it'll come back
opportunities
up, but
that
it's just stressful.
these rich
So,
people who
just
could
the
afford
jet strategy, I'm fine
$150,000
for myself.
Teslas have
Anyway,
from the
இப்போ தான்
south.
வாங்காதீங்க, but at the moment.
And for all the rights and
But this is a
wrongs,
good
that was a
stock.
catastrophic
I'm really
political
confident.
disaster. And partly
It's based on
because
Australian
it
real
came
estate
across
market,
as
so it'll
people
just
who
have like
care
good
about
steady
environment and
growth.
climate because they're comfortable and wealthy and well established in society. And
Stress to put you into it.
and then standing from their high pulpit and telling
I
them
will.
what's
I will.
happening.
I'll tell you when.
Uh,
What's your idea?
From my personal experience, the best example
What's
of
your
where
idea?
I've worked on a big climate and environment issue with the local community
நான் கூட வாங்குறேன்.
and
வாங்கி என்ன
putting
பண்ண
it into
போறீங்க?
the context of the SDGs. I worked with a very remote set of
Okay.
communities,
என்ன ஒரு
particularly
Airbnb
indigenous communities in a
பண்ணிடலாம்
very
இந்த
remote part of Australia.
நான்ப்பா
With a
இது
very
வந்து ஒரு டென்ட் கூட
substantial
கிடையாது, ஒரு
opposition to
வுடன்
a
பேரல்
massive
மாதிரி
fossil
பெருசு.
fuel project being
ஸோ
put
அது
in
ப்ராக்டிக்கலாக
place.
ஒரு டென்ட் மாதிரி அதை தவகில
A really
கவுத்தி
good
உள்ள
understanding.
பெட்டு
This was
மட்டும்
in the
போட்டுருவாங்க.
Kimberley. They had a really good
கிறிஸ்மஸ்
understanding
டைம்
from
அப்பா
watching
வந்து
40
250
years
நைட்டு
of
ஏதோ சொன்னான்.
development just
அது
down south
சம்மந்தமே
in the
இல்லாமல் ஏதோ ஒரு
Pilbara,
மவுண்டன்ல அது
where
மட்டும்
mining
எடுக்கிறாங்க.
companies and governments said
Wild
this is
out.
going to fix all of the indigenous health and welfare problems and everything's going to be
you
fine.
can.
You'll all be wealthy and comfortable
அதில்
and
ஒரு
you'll all
குட்டி
have
காட்டேஜ்
jobs.
மாதிரி
And that's
ஓலை
been
நம்ம வாங்கினோம்னா அதை கூட
absolute
நீங்கள்
rubbish,
பண்ணலாம்.
total disaster in the
நல்ல
Pilbara. Many, if not most, of the indigenous
சரி, ஆனால்
community
அவங்க
worse
ஒரு
off than they were
$1,000
40 years
ஏதாச்சும்
ago.
இன்வெஸ்ட் பண்ணுவோம்
And the
அப்படின்னா நான் கொஞ்சம்
people in the Kimberley
கொஞ்சம்
went,
இந்த கோவிட்னால
yeah, we've
எல்லாம்
heard
திடீர்னு
that,
திடீர்னு மாறி மாறி
civilized.
எல்லாம் இதாகிட்டு
And
இருக்கு.
I worked collaboratively with some of the most extraordinary communities and people I've ever worked with. And it was driven from the local community. And it was a series of social, economic, environmental, cultural, climate conversations. And I was there to support, find money, give strategic advice, make networks, get international context. They ran the campaign and they won it.
I got it.
Because they were driven by the whole range of social and economic and other elements that you see in the SDGs. The other place that, for me, and looking at the role of CAN, Climate Action Network, globally, is the work in the developing world, in nations where these issues of environment and climate are social, economic, cultural, more than anything else, and where it has to be led by the local community. So for me, the examples of where collaborative work is effective and has an impact is where those directly affected by the impacts of the changes are driving and leading, and where they get support from organisations and individuals like myself to help them deliver the outcomes they want.
Thank you, Glenn. Okay, it looks like we're running out of time now, but I will open it up to the attendees if anyone has a question for one of the panellists. That's okay. I do have one more question, if you don't mind. But just to finish off, I think for individuals who are listening or who will listen to the recording, what are some actions that they can take to be involved, to progress the SDGs, and support your areas of work? If you could each maybe just say a few words on that before we finish up, that would be great. Anna?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Look, I think from my point of view, from government policy, from a government's, really where the influence is, I think, is government and government policy and government implementation. So my view to everyone out there would be, think very long and hard carefully about who you vote for. And, as everything Glenn's outlined, and that there are ways in which, promoting, if you don't like a policy and if you don't like our national climate change or lack thereof government policy, then start advocating and it's people power, I think, in this sector insofar as that they're only in there because they're voted. They are, voted members of Parliament. So if we don't like what they're doing, we need to get them out.
Thanks, Emma. Deborah?
Yeah, I'll go back really to your first question, which was, about some of the stories in the book Guardian Eden, Champions of Climate Action, a plug. But it does actually bring a lot of the information around the SDGs already through personal stories. There are a dozen different activists who work in completely different spaces. It's written for anybody who can, basically read English. It's 13 years and up, but it's you're following a personal story and you're connecting at a deeper emotional level. But so you're probably unaware, this was the design, was that you would be unaware that you were actually absorbing a lot of very important practical information because these issues are overwhelming. And what I found was most important, and in curating this information, which gets back to, Charles's work and the SDGs, we need this really, really good base of facts, evidence, data, science to underpin it. But we do need personal stories, and we really need to feel that there's a place that we can connect. So these people come from all different ages and backgrounds, and they have just started to learn, and they've started to really feel motivated by the fact that the rhetoric coming from their governments and industry was kind of the same and didn't kind of make a whole lot of sense from the way they were perceiving the world. So it's, I think it's really important to remember that we all do have agency in our own lives, and that there's a lot of really good material out there that we can connect with, and there are so many people in grassroots communities doing really brilliant work. There is space for everyone, and we need all of the diverse voices. And I really would like to probably end on saying I really wish that we would be more led by Indigenous Australians. I would love to see Care for Country go back to First Nations people.
Thank you, Deborah. Charles?
Yeah, so I have to agree with Deborah, because First Nations people understand systems and how systems work, and I think Glenn answered it well too, talking about systems approach at community level. Whether the thinking is at the macro level, at strategy level, or micro level, at community level, the approach is the same as building that understanding about the attitudes for the institutions and the structures. Those pillars of peace are demonstrated, how they're at play within a country, within a society, and what are the opportunities to nudge that system, to shift that system. And that's not stop or start. It's about what are the opportunities to change the system so the intent of the system and the encoded norms shift into in a positive direction. Thank you for the discussion. That would certainly be my answer, is understanding the systems of play, whether that's, as Deborah suggested, at the interpersonal level, family level, community level, or country level. Thanks for the discussion tonight.
Thanks, Charles. And Glenn, you put in the discussion board there, Better Futures Australia. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I've got two, as usual. Firstly, Deborah raised it. There's so many examples of communities who've gotten off their butts and done amazing stuff. One of my favourite, because I love this community, is Tathra on the far south coast of New South Wales, who've been hit by terrible bushfires over the last few years. They have just fundraised in their own community to become 100% renewable, and they made an announcement in the last couple of days. There's other towns like Yakandanda and a whole bunch of others. Brilliant, amazing. Have a look at their model, fantastic. But Better Futures Australia is really exciting. We're involved in a Climate Action Network. It's about bringing together disparate parts of societal group, land management, business, local government, a whole range of other sectors, social services, health, to have separate forums to discuss what they as individual organisations and as a group can do in the lead up to the Glasgow conference next year, which is the next post-Paris conference being held in November. And we'll have a conference in the middle of next year, but it's a really exciting initiative. There's the website, betterfutures.org.au, and really good bunch of people and part of a global movement, including this amazing group called We Are In, which are all of the non-federal government actors in the US who, when Trump pulled out of Paris, said, bugger you, and went down. It's California, it's New York, but it's a whole heap of businesses and a whole heap of social NGOs and others who've gotten together and would have made US meet their original Paris goals without Trump. So that's a sort of really exciting initiative that you can get involved in, bring together a whole bunch of people, and we can scare the crap out of people running Canberras. in a very non-violent way, of course.
Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the end of this evening's session. I would just like to say a big thank you to the panel speakers for this wonderful discussion and for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us this evening. I would just like to say, if you're interested in the UNAA, please get in touch with us. I will put the screen back on so you can see the link to our details. The next event that we have coming up is the future of non-for-profits, surviving and thriving in a post-COVID-19 world, and that will be held on Wednesday, the 2nd of December. So we encourage you to join us for that session. Now, if there is no other comments from our speakers, I would just like to say thank you for coming. Stay safe and have a fantastic night. Thank you.